This is the Advanced Brain Podcast with third-generation neurotechnology pioneer, entrepreneur, best-selling author, music producer, keynote and TEDx speaker, Alex Doman. Improve your mental wellness as Alex sits down with the leading thought leaders of our time about how to optimize your brain, body, and life with the latest and most powerful tools to help you reach your unlimited potential. This episode was previously recorded and released as part of the Sound Brain Fitness series and is being re-released here in the Advanced Brain Podcast. Now, listen in and discover how to become the best version of yourself with Alex Doman.
Welcome, everyone. It's the start of the hour, so we're going to get this month's Sound Brain Fitness series teleseminar going. And tonight, I'm very excited to bring you our guest and an exciting conversation that we're going to have about conscious listening. The Sound Brain Fitness teleseminar is brought to you by Advanced Brain Technologies. The calls run 1 hour long. The call agenda will outline an introduction of our topic and our guest. Following our conversation, we will move into a question and answer period where you can call in and have your questions answered live. And then we'll also be taking a number of the questions that were submitted when you registered for tonight's teleseminar. At the end of the call, we're going to let you know how to get in contact with our guest and make a special announcement, and also tell you about our next teleseminar coming up. So tonight, very excited to bring you Conscious Listening with Julian Treasure. I want to first introduce my guest, and then we're going to get into what our conversation is going to be about. Julian Treasure is an author of the book called Sound Business. He's an international public speaker and chairman of the Sound Agency, which is a UK-based consultancy that helps clients worldwide to achieve better results by optimizing the sound they make in every aspect of business, specializing in creating effective and appropriate generative soundscapes for branded spaces such as shops, offices, and malls. Julian's TED Talks on sound have been viewed by an estimated 4 million viewers 4 million times. Now, I found out about Julian when I was doing the research for my book, Healing at the Speed of Sound, with my friend and co-author, Don Campbell. And we were researching really dynamic presentations that we could share in the book on sound. And we discovered a treasure in Julian Treasure. We found one of his TED Talks on optimizing sound health. I believe it was eight steps to optimizing sound health. And it's like he was speaking from our heart with a different voice, carrying the message of the importance of sound in our lives, its healing aspects, how noise hurts, and how sound can also heal. We found a brother across the pond over in the UK. Julian, are you with us now?
I certainly am. I'm here, Alex. Yes, and delighted to be here.
We're so happy to have you on the call. And for our listeners, Julian has stayed up after a very long day. It's 1 a.m. in Surrey. And I know it's been a long day, and we really appreciate you taking the time to join us this evening. And it's really a testament, Julian, to your passion and your mission to make the world sound more beautiful. And I just want to share with our listeners what we're going to be discussing tonight, and then I want to turn the time over to you. So we're going to be exploring listening, our active relationship with sound. Listening is something that almost everyone does. It profoundly impacts our health, effectiveness, and our relationships, even changes our reality. Yet almost no one thinks about it consciously or trains to become better at it. So tonight, Julian's going to cover what listening is, how it differs from hearing, and how we do it, why our listening is in danger, the pros and cons of headphones, and his 5 practices for becoming a conscious listener. Julian, I'm so excited to hear from you and to share this exciting topic with our audience. The time is yours.
Thank you so much, Alex. And it's not a problem staying up this late, actually, to talk about sound. I can talk about sound for hours and hours and hours, and especially to talk about sound with sound lovers. I love talking to sound lovers, and I think it's probably fair to describe all you guys out there as sound lovers. Do you think that's right? I think it probably is. You wouldn't be here if you didn't. And I feel so lucky in doing what I do. You know, when I tell people what I do at parties, they always go, "That's really interesting, isn't it?" It's a bit like selling chocolate or something. And do you know, that tells me that I think in most people in the world there's a pent-up desire to know more about sound, and in particular to listen better. That's an experience I have over and over again. I've been doing what I do now around the world, working with major brands, speaking about sound on conference platforms. I've been doing this for 10 years now, and we've worked with some of the world's best-known brands. We've worked with people like Nokia, Unilever, Colgate-Palmolive. Just recently, actually, we've had a wonderful project in London in a little store that you guys might have heard of called Harrods. And they've opened the new Toy Kingdom, which is a beautiful experience. And for them, we designed 5 generative soundscapes. So you come in, there's a circus soundscape called Big Top, then you go into an enchanted forest soundscape, and on through Wonderland into Space Odyssey, and then a reading room. And these are all generative, and it's so far from what would have been done a few years ago, which is mindless playing of kiddie pop music. So I'm really excited by the way that the market is opening up, by the way that corporations are starting to listen. And I guess that's becoming our speciality, really, retail soundscapes. And that is wonderful for me because it's making a big difference to a lot of people. You know, we spend a lot of time out in shops or in public spaces and being assailed, bombarded, don't we, by noise all the time. Along the way in those 10 years, I've written that book, Sound Business, which has become quite significant. I mean, it's a fantastic calling card to say, would you like a copy of my book? Of course. But, you know, I had the weirdest experience. I don't know if any of you guys have ever written books or large volumes of text, but I had the weirdest experience when I was writing that. You know, I'd be writing away and I'd be reading what I was writing and saying to myself, I didn't know I knew that, or I've never actually thought that before, and it's coming out of me as I write. It was a strange experience, almost like channeling of some kind. But the book has been great, and it really, I think, summarized a growing movement, which is for brands to understand they exist in 5 senses, not just one. There's been a lot of press about it, and, you know, the media love this stuff as well. And I think, you know, Alex has probably had that experience too, and I know Don did during his life, that the media, particularly, of course, radio, but the press as well, they love stories about sound. They find it, like all of us, very interesting. So again, that tells me there's this thirst out there, and I'm excited because there's this fertile ground for those of us who care about sound to speak into. Right now, for some reason, I think that's becoming more and more true. And the TED Talks have emphasized that as well. Actually, I had a 4th one go up 2 weeks ago, which is about architecture. It's called Designing with Our Ears. It's a plea to architects to start designing spaces, especially schools and hospitals, which are fit for purpose instead of the terrible acoustics that we have to endure. And you know, if you put the 4 TED Talks together, they've been seen something like 5.5 million times now, which again indicates to me this thirst for information. Now, I'm not an academic, and I'm not a professor of sound or anything like that. I think my role in this whole matter is to shout about it. I've become pretty decent at public speaking, and I'm quite good at making a noise about this, and I think somebody needs to. You know, I'm doing a talk in a couple of weeks' time to the UK's Institute of Acousticians, and these are people who really care about sound. They really know about sound, but my talk is called Why Nobody Listens to Acousticians. And you know what? They have a presentation problem. They know their stuff, but they tend to be somewhat dry and theoretical and full of numbers when they're presenting. We need to get politicians on board. We need to get a lot of people who are controlling, particularly schools, to understand the importance of sound and listening. So my vision is to make the world sound beautiful. And there are two aspects to that. One is the one we're going to talk about tonight, which is conscious listening, and indeed conscious making of sound as individuals, as private citizens. Now, they go together, because as soon as you start consciously listening, then you can't be making uncaring sound. You can't be imposing your sound on other people, because you hear it and you listen to it. So that's one part of it. If we're all consciously listening, we can all start to complain about bad sound around us. We can all start to design the sound around us. I call that soundscaping, in honor of Murray Schafer, who coined that word. And the other part of it is what the sound agency is doing, which is showing brands that good sound is good business, which is, I'm very glad to say, fortunately, the truth. Good sound is good business, bad sound is bad business. And you put those two things together and we have a chance of making the world sound beautiful, because the brands will start to make better sound and be conscious about the sound they're making. So it won't be that we're surrounded by this constant noise, which is like the exhaust gas of the economy. Instead, we'll have organizations consciously creating sound that's appropriate and effective. And we'll have all of us as individuals consciously listening. Well, that's a dream. That's where I want to get to. So it's been exciting for me just this last month, I suppose, to take the work I've done over 10 years with brands and to move it into the personal domain. So, it struck me, how most people never listen well. They've never trained their speaking voice, which is another important aspect of this. And they're unconscious of the sound they make and they surround themselves with. So what I'm doing now is training people to become what I call masters of sound. It's a slightly grandiloquent title, but hey, you've got to market these things a bit. And I'm teaching conscious listening. I'm teaching powerful speaking techniques and overall how to take control of your personal sound in order to transform relationships where, that's the ground where listening really plays out in its most powerful form. Well-being, because, there are so many implications of sound on our health. And if we're numb to it, if we're not listening, these things happen to us without our even perceiving them. And even success in life, listening is a very important aspect of leadership, for example. Have you ever had the experience of working for a boss who doesn't listen? It's not easy, is it? So all of those things are important. Listening consciously, speaking powerfully, and soundscaping. Those are the three skills I want to develop. And in fact, I'm on a campaign to get these things taught in schools, which they're not, are they? And I think that's absolutely crazy. Can I just say a word about how I got here, just to give you a hint of the approach, really, as I'm going to take tonight. I'm a musician. Well, I'm a drummer, and I have heard all the jokes. I think my favorite one about drummers is, how do you know if the stage is level? The drummer is drooling out of both sides of his mouth. So I know all these jokes, and I've suffered many of them through the years. But even a drummer, actually especially a drummer, has to listen, and if you play in a band, you learn to listen. Musicians listen differently to most people. You have to, if you're playing in a group, if you're going to be good, and if you ever want to get in the groove, then you have to be listening really well to all the other players. And so I swapped. My mother thought I was taking piano lessons at school. I secretly swapped it at the age of 13 for drum lessons and never told her for 3 years. So I became a drummer, which didn't make her very happy when I bought a drum kit. And I played professionally for a while and made a lot of music with a lot of people. And then I got a job in publishing and launched a magazine publishing company and built that up over 15 years. But all the way through that day job working with brands, at night I was drumming and playing, listening. And when I sold that magazine publishing business in 2001, I wanted to bring the two halves of me together. So I am really, really privileged to do something I love, which is be passionate about sound, work with sound, and seek to make the world sound beautiful. So it's a joy, and I'm very privileged to be speaking to you guys tonight about it. It's a real honor. So, is it okay with you if I share some of the training that I've developed in conscious listening? Just a flavour, because I can, as I said, I can talk for hours and hours and hours about this, and I've got kind of 20 minutes or something like that. Let's start by just thinking about the difference between hearing and listening. Hearing is a physical process. It starts when sound waves touch you inside your head. It's a very intimate thing. Now, I know there was a great talk by Seth Horowitz in this series quite recently about hearing, and so those of you who heard that, you're already experts in the neuroscience of hearing. But I'm fascinated by the way that physicality works as well. You know, these sound waves, it's incredible, isn't it, that one vibrating membrane in our ear and three tiny bones, which oscillate thousands of times a second from the moment they're formed until many people say hearing is the last sense to die when we go. Those bones and that one membrane can separate, can translate to us all the richness of sound around us in a sphere 360 degrees in 10 octaves if we've got perfect hearing, which I don't anymore, by the way. I've lost everything above about 12.5 kilohertz through cymbal abuse over the years. But a young child, 10 octaves. We see just one octave, and we hear 10. And hearing, as I know Seth said in that talk, hearing is our primary warning sense. So it goes into the limbic system. It's in at the lizard brain level very deeply. We perceive it very fast. It's a very powerful emoter. If I want to warn you about something, I don't wave at you, do I? So hearing is very, very powerful. Listening is different. Listening is what happens once the hearing process has translated that physical vibration of your eardrum into electrical activity in your brain. The neurons are firing, and you then have decisions to make. Listening is active. Hearing is actually quite passive. I mean, if you think about it, and I always say this, we've become a very ocular culture, and I'm sure you guys all know that. And many of you probably regret it, as I do, that the balance has swung so far towards the eyes. The eyes are very directed. And I mean, if you want to take an Eastern model for this, a sort of yin-yang model, think about yang would be much more eyes, outward going, directed, forceful, energy going outwards, and I'm in control of that, aren't I? I can close my eyelids. Well, you have no earlids. Ears are receptacles. They're holes in your head. It's much more of a yin sense, much more feminine, dark, as opposed to the light and heat of the eye sense. And I think in the modern world, we've become much fonder of talking than of listening, and much fonder of sending than of receiving. For many people, sadly, the bit where they're quiet and somebody else is talking isn't really listening at all. It's just preparing what they're going to say next. So in that world, listening is somewhat undervalued. It is a skill, though. It's the definition of listening that I like to use. I mean, there are many definitions, and I'm not saying by any means that this is the definition, but it's my definition of listening. My definition is making meaning from sound. Making meaning from sound. Now, we're surrounded by sound the whole time. And to make meaning out of it is work. It's an activity. It's a skill. It's not a natural physical phenomenon. It's not like hearing. It is something you can improve and work at, or something you can leave fallow and allow to atrophy and to die. And sadly, I do think that for many, many people, listening is a dying skill. There are many reasons for that, and I'll touch on a couple of those in a moment. But first, let's just consider the main ways in which we exercise this skill of listening. Well, first of all, pattern recognition. That's a very important part of listening. We're very good at spotting patterns, particularly our name. I mean, if Alex and I were talking to each other in a noisy hotel bar or something like that, and somebody said Alex, then he would perk up and probably turn around. I wouldn't. That's a pattern that means a great deal more to him than it does to me. Our name is the pattern we recognize most powerfully from, obviously, when we're a tiny baby. But there are many other patterns that are of great significance to us. They may be word patterns. Obviously, language is full of patterns. They may be warning or danger patterns. I remember reading a man's account of being lost in the African veldt, or whatever they call it, the plains, with the big grass. And he knew there were lions around. And he said never has he heard so acutely as at that moment. He was listening for anything that would indicate that he was being stalked. So patterns of danger are very important to us. And there are other patterns which we experience from virtually 12 weeks after conception. I mean, I don't know if you know that we're hearing before our ears are formed. So just 12 weeks after conception, we're listening through our whole bodies. You're doing it right now. You're just not aware of that because your ears are such specialists in the art of hearing. And obviously I'll give you a great example of that skill, which is Dame Evelyn Glennie, a woman I hugely admire. And by the way, if any of you do not have her DVD, Touch the Sound, I strongly recommend it. It's a most marvelous piece of work, very beautiful. Evelyn Glennie is a world-famous percussionist, plays with great orchestras all over the world, and her ears don't work. She is profoundly deaf. She hears through her body, and she plays in bare feet, and she learned to do that at school when a most enlightened teacher started with banging on a big drum, and then they started to differentiate different tones. It took years and years for her to learn the skill, and she now has it. So you're doing that right now. It's just your ears override it because they're so sensitive. So you kind of think that you're hearing only with your ears. Well, you're not. So pattern recognition, I was saying, starts very young. And the most obvious pattern that we recognize is the heartbeat. I mean, our mother's heartbeat is the sound that we're surrounded by. It's very noisy in the womb. And it is a sound that many people still find quite reassuring. Interestingly, by the way, and I haven't got any scientific evidence for this, the heartbeat is in 3 time, if you think about it. It goes lub-dub, pause, lub-dub, pause, lub-dub, pause. So it's a waltz. I think that's probably something to do with why 3 time is very rarely threatening. Normally it's a happy time signature. And you don't get many bits of martial music or aggressive thrash metal or whatever in 3 time. Just an observation. So, pattern recognition. That's one way in which we extract signal from noise and we start to make sense of the sound around us and we make meaning from sound. Another important one is differencing. And again, that example of the guy listening for the lion, it wasn't just patterns he was listening for, it was any difference from the background murmuring of the grass in the wind. And we do that all the time. Our brains are very good at setting aside constant sounds, especially if those sounds are stochastic, which means composed of lots and lots of little events randomly happening. So think of gentle rainfall outside your window at night. Now that's a pleasing thought, isn't it? Almost everybody loves that sound. But compare that to a dripping tap, which is essentially the same core sound. It's a drip of water. One is beautiful, the other one wildly irritating. So there's a point at which the randomness creates, and the number of random events create a pleasing wash, and that's what I call stochastic sound. Another example of that would be birdsong, or it might be wind in leaves. And that's why I think wind, water and birds, all three have that in common. I think those are very healthy sounds for us. And many people, I think, are pining for those in cities. So differencing is a powerful way, again, in which we're making meaning from the sound around us. We're dismissing constant sound, and we're listening very carefully to significant differences in sound. Then there's a whole bunch of filters. Now, this is the most important part, probably, of the listening that I'm teaching. Most people are completely unaware of the filters that surround them. And those filters are the most significant way that we are deciding what to pay attention to. If you're making meaning from sound, it's all a process of selection, really. So we're selecting what we're going to listen to, and whatever that is selected according to a whole bunch of filters that we're not even aware of. Most of them are unconscious. Things like our culture. So, give you an example. I love going to Finland. The Finns are very taciturn people. Maybe there's some Finns on this call right now. And this is very affectionately meant, you guys, if you're there. But I've often heard the joke that a Finn's idea of a good night out is to go round to somebody's house, sit in silence for 3 hours, and then go home. They are very quiet people. The Finns don't say anything unless it needs to be said. You contrast that listening with, say, Italians, where if 3 people aren't talking at once, it's not a proper conversation, and it needs to be loud and with lots of gesticulating in order to be sincerely meant. Well, that's a different kind of listening to altogether. And that's a cultural filter, which creates a whole different way of being. And then, of course, as well as culture, we've got language itself. I mean, there are some languages on this earth that don't have words for time at all. And that would change your listening, wouldn't it? No way of expressing tomorrow or yesterday. And then there are other languages which are entirely tonal. And even some languages, I say entirely tonal, which are tonal. So you think of Mandarin, Chinese or something like that, very tonal languages where the tone is actually a significant part of the meaning. And even there's a whistling language in the Canary Islands which is completely tonal, no words at all. So we've got culture, language, and then there's things we learn as we develop, values and ideals, beliefs, attitudes, all these things that we develop as we grow up, and they start to form filters that we're not even aware of, and then it becomes very difficult to listen to people or to perceive people who are in contravention of those filters, outside those filters, expectations of people, of situations, and intentions as we go down into a specific situation. All these things are filters that change our listening, and we're not necessarily aware of it. The fun starts when we become aware of those filters and we start to play with them as control surfaces. Now, I have to say at this point, danger, because I do believe that we are losing our listening, particularly in modern Western industrialized societies. And sadly, that paradigm and that disease of losing listening is spreading the world over. So you've got societies where listening was incredibly important. I mean, think of India with its classical music tradition where it was entirely oral. You know, in the whole of Indian classical music, not a note is written down. If you want to learn how to play the tabla, you sit at the feet of the master and he goes da 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 da, and you play it over and over again till you've learned it. And even in those societies, you know, our Western ways of sweeping the board, and people are starting to be headphones in, TV on, and not listening So it is a real issue that we're losing our listening, partly due to the noise around us. The world is getting noisier all the time. I know aircraft are getting quieter, but there are more of them. Same with cars. Just more people making more noise, and population density is the biggest factor in noise, really. There's no doubt that the world is a noisier place year by year. And so we tend to stop listening. We tend to get into the habit of just suppressing this sound and not paying attention to it. And then you've got many other factors here. I mean, there are lots of other reasons why we're not listening so well. We're desensitized by the exaggerated noise around us. Music is now pumped up and compressed to the max. The mastering process is to square wave everything. Any of you who are technical know what that means. Basically, no dynamics at all. The whole thing is at maximum volume the whole time. And headphones, don't get me started. Well, all right, I will start.
Please start. Now, Julian, let's go deep on headphones. This is a conversation that I on a daily basis, and many of our listeners use our programs, which are headphone-based programs. So we're using the tool of headphones to train listening, yet headphones are also a reason that we're losing our listening. So let's go a bit deeper on that.
Well, like everything else that we touch as human beings, headphones can be used for good or for ill, like the internet, like books, like everything, can be turned to good or ill. The good in headphones is enormous because you can listen to sound without disturbing other people, and you can listen to high-quality sound as you're moving around. You can change your experience of life, and so on and so on. Let me just cover the perils because I think everybody's pretty much aware of the benefits of headphones. So a couple of things. First of all, 4 initials, NIHL, noise-induced hearing loss. 1 in 8 American teenagers has got some form of noise-induced hearing loss, probably due to headphone abuse, not to listening to loud music or going to concerts. Those things are not ever shown to have had very significant effects on people's hearing. I mean, you'd have to be a musician playing every night. And even Pete Townsend, and I've spoken to Pete about this, and he says his hearing, and you may know he's down to 40% in one ear, his hearing was killed not by standing in front of stacks of Marshall amplifiers at the loudest gig on record, or doing that night after night, but by being in studios when somebody bumps into the mixing desk and sends feedback through the headphones that he's wearing at 150 decibels for 2 seconds. That's what's killed his hearing. And so listening to loud music on headphones for hours a day is desperate. Your hearing is, the analogy I always use, it's like ice. And if you erode the ice from underneath, you don't know until it's too late. Once you go through it, there's no coming back. Those little hairs in your ears are incredibly delicate and they do not grow back. So far, nobody's found any way of regenerating those. And the best we can do is mechanical digital hearing aids, which are not very nice, I can tell you. If you've ever heard a simulation of what life is like with a cochlear implant, you really do not want to go there. So the rule with headphones, 2 rules I'd suggest. One is, if you can't hear somebody speaking to you in a reasonably loud voice from about a meter away, it's too loud. Second, if you're going to use headphones, invest in the best you can afford. Probably invest in better ones than you can afford. Because with great quality, you'll be able to listen at a lower volume. Poorer quality headphones, the louder you have to have it to get the same effect, the same sort of visceral feeling that the music's really powerful. So for goodness sake, don't ever let your children use cheap headphones. They should never use them. For 85 decibels, the recommended maximum listening time, if I remember rightly, is under an hour a day, something like 45 minutes. And there are kids out there who are listening for hours a day at 100 decibels. It's desperate. The other thing about headphones, well, the other couple of things I'd just like to point out about headphones. One is the phenomenon that Murray Schafer, again, he's a great hero of mine, coined another word, schizophrenia. which is this dislocate between what we're hearing and what we're seeing, takes us out of being present, takes us away from being conscious, and it puts us into a slightly altered state. So that's when you're walking around and you're not listening to anything that you're seeing. There's no connection between you and the outside world at all. Now, sometimes that can be a good thing if the outside world's threatening, noisy, or horrible, but not as a rule, surely. And then the final thing about headphones is the phenomenon of changing public spaces where we were at least conscious of each other, and you were listening to the mass of humanity, take a station or a train carriage or something like that. We're turning those from shared spaces into millions of sound bubbles. Everybody's in their own bubble and nobody's listening to anybody. So that's, to me, not a great idea generally. Because, see, the reason I bang on about listening the whole time is that listening is the doorway to understanding. Listening is the doorway to understanding. Only without conscious listening can a lot of terrible things happen that do happen in the world. All forms of abuse require depersonalization, or most. I mean, unless it's an absolutely personal rage attack on somebody that you're listening to all too well, but those are relatively rare. I'm talking about all sorts of war and brutality and so forth, which requires depersonalizing somebody and not listening to them, turning them into a caricature, making their views extreme and ridiculous, and so forth. Relationships, I mean, I don't have to be as extreme as talking about war, just to think about relationships, where what's the most common complaint in relationships, particularly from women? He never listens. He doesn't listen to me. She doesn't listen to me. So there are huge implications of not listening. And there's a great book and also another TED talk I'd just like to refer you to, but without going in, I don't think we've got time to go into another big topic, which is technology. Sherry Turkle, a great TED talk given just this last year in Long Beach, and her book is called Alone Together. And her proposition is that technology is not bringing us together. It's actually driving us apart, because we're ending up with hundreds and hundreds of shallow, brief relationships with people instead of a few deep ones. And her picture of that is her daughter with a couple of friends sitting next to each other, all looking at a screen in their hand. So that's not listening, if you ask me. That's a phenomenon I call personal broadcasting. Now, I do tweet and I do Facebook, kind of reluctantly to a degree, but I am very conscious when I'm doing those things that that's one-way traffic. There's very little listening in those processes. So what we should talk about is how to get it back. I mean, how can we get our listening back? And I'm just going to spend the last few minutes talking about that. Because in my TED talk on this, I gave 5 simple exercises. I was 6 minutes long, that talk. I have 5 exercises, and I do talk about this at some length. And in a moment, well, actually, now's probably as good a time as any, Alex, if you don't mind for me to mention that. I've got a webinar tomorrow night, free webinar tomorrow night. Well, I'll be going into this for an hour in detail. There are 5 of them, and I'm going to cover 3 of them with you now. I don't think I've got time to do all 5, but I would like to do 3 in a bit more detail than I normally do. And I've chosen the 3 that I think you guys are particularly going to enjoy. So first, this. Now, I hope you enjoyed that. That was probably 20 seconds of silence, relative silence, depending on where you all are. I hope you're in a nice, quiet place and you did enjoy that. I adore silence. It's becoming a rare commodity in this world. I've experienced it in different places, and I've become very passionate about it. I believe there are different forms of silence. For example, I go walking in the Dolomite Mountains in northern Italy, the most beautiful mountains I know. And when you get above the tree line, I remember one experience, we were on My favourite mountain up there is called Civetta, which means the owl. And there's a scree slope you can go to. You're above the tree line. We're about 1,800 metres, something like that high. And so no trees, there's no birds. And apart from the very overflight by a jet, if you choose a still day, you get an extraordinary silence up there, as long as there isn't a group of Italian kids marching behind you, because they all sing while they're marching. So you can hear it coming from about 2 kilometres behind you. It takes 25 minutes to crescendo and then fade away again. But in between those, you get this huge, expansive, glorious, shining silence of nature, which is a very different silence to the silence you get if you go deep in a cave. That's the other place I know where I've experienced absolute silence. And down there, that's a silence which is dark and velvety and envelops you, almost smothers you. So silence is a sound, I think, just like black is a colour. Silence is a sound. And I'd like just to mention a place I went and give you some examples of this, some things to meditate on actually with silence. My practice for silence is, as I'm suggesting to you, is to have 5 minutes a day. You can have lots more if you like, but a minimum of 5 minutes a day, just sit in silence, or relative quiet if you can't get silence. Let's not get OCD about this. Relative silence, just sit and enjoy it. And while you're considering that, let me give you some meditations which I found when I went to the Isola San Giulio in Lake Orta. It's a beautiful little island. You go there on a boat. And it's an island that's got a monastery on it, or a nunnery actually. So it's just a group of nuns who live there. And around the nunnery there's a passage, a path. And the idea is you walk around this path in silence, so it's called the Path of Silence. And there are meditations every so often. So I'll just read these to you and let you contemplate these before we move on to the second exercise. In the silence, you accept and understand. In the silence, you receive all. Silence is the language of love. Silence is the peace of oneself. Silence is music and harmony. Silence is truth and prayer. In the silence, you meet the Master. In the silence, you breathe God. Walls are in the mind. The moment is present, here and now. Leave yourself and what is yours. Now that's a good walk. And I hope you enjoyed those, and you can take some of those with you. Just contemplate those while you're sitting in silence. I'm not trying to get you to meditate necessarily. The silence is the important thing. And just a few minutes a day, it's a recalibration. It resets your ears. It's like a sorbet in a meal. It just allows you to reset to zero before you embark on the day. Well, you can do it any time in the day. It recalibrates you every time. Second exercise, listening positions. Now this is quite a complex one, and I'm just going to touch on one of them to give you an example. I'm not talking about physical position, so it doesn't matter whether I'm standing up at the moment. It doesn't matter about how you are physically. I'm talking about a metaphorical listening position. Imagine there's a house on a hill. If you don't like the way the house looks, you can walk around the hill and see how it looks from the other side, can't you?
Thank you for listening to the Advanced Brain Podcast with best-selling author, keynote speaker, and founder of Advanced Brain Technologies, Alex Doman. In the show notes, you can find links to all the resources mentioned in this episode. Please subscribe to the podcast from whichever platform you might be listening in. Of course, it's free to subscribe, and it ensures that every time we post a new episode, you'll find it right there waiting for you to listen to in your podcast app of choice. And for more information regarding the world's most innovative neuroscience-based music programs for optimal human performance, please visit advancedbrain.com.